Well, thank you for the introduction. It's really good to be here this morning. Paula, I compliment you, and I know I was already thanked you for the invitation to speak, but I really appreciate it. And I also thank all of you for coming out. I thought there'd be just maybe me today and Paula. So it's on Friday morning. So it's really good to be here. And I'm going to talk about the future of, my thoughts on the future of irrigated agriculture in the central and the southern high plains. And really what we're talking about is depletion of the Ogallala aquifer. And that's, and I could sit down right now, and that's really the summary, because what's happening is the Ogallala aquifer is being depleted. It's not sustainable, and most of the aquifer in the central and the southern parts are minimal recharge, and ultimately we're going to use it over time. And so what I'd like to talk about today, and give you a little bit of background on the Ogallala. How many of you are experts on the Ogallala? Not very many. I thought we'd get some of my Texas A&M colleagues here, and I'd have to be quiet because they'd hit me up on it, because there's lots of experts that are here at the meeting. But there would be a map of the Ogallala. It underlays 8 states in the Great Plains. It's the largest freshwater aquifer in the United States, and arguably the first or second largest in the world. It's very important, and I would say it's in my opinion, in Kansas, it's the most important natural resource issue that we have. And I would arguably say it is one of the most important in the country and in the world as far as food security goes. It's 30% of the irrigated acreage in the country. 40% of the feedlot cattle come out of this region, and it's directly related to feed and water from the Ogallala aquifer. We also have a thriving bioenergy operation there. And so I'm going to focus on really what I call the central and the southern, because as we look at it, and I give you a little background, so I'm going to give you some background on the Ogallala, so that you get some feeling of what it is, talk a little bit about the problem, and then tell you what's happening in Kansas, because again, it is a state issue. And we own our water in Kansas, and the federal government has no jurisdiction over groundwater. And we're different than Nebraska, we're different than Texas, we have different rules. Everybody comes under somewhat under Western water law, that we have first in time, first in right. So keep that in mind. It's a property right, and we're not going to take your water away from you. Again, it's the largest aquifer in use in the United States. And just a little bit of background. And throughout the aquifer, expansion of irrigation really began after World War II, when we had the technology coming out of the 1930s. This was the area that was really suffered through the Dust Bowl stages. And in that southern area, Texas to Kansas, our annual rainfall is all the way from about 12. As you get into central Kansas, where it's a little more sustainable, up to maybe 25 inches of rainfall. It's very heterogeneous. And if you look at the aquifer, this would be saturated thickness. And you're all groundwater specialists, but think about saturated thickness. Is the thicker the saturated thickness, that means the more water you have. You can think about the amount of water. So if you look at Nebraska, up on the upper part there, they were blessed with lots of acres, square miles of the aquifer, and lots of water. So their issues are much different than what we get as we get south into Kansas, eastern Colorado, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Texas. And this would be in 2000. This would be the estimated saturated thickness in the year 2000. If we go back, it is recognized as a local and a regional issue. It's every irrigator in Kansas that's on the Ogallala knows that we're depleting the Ogallala. So it's recognized. So it's when we go out and we talk about it, and I show data on the depletion, nobody argues with it. It's a real problem. They know it's a problem. They've been impacted by it. One of the concerns when we do management is it's a common pool resource. And I could give an hour on what common pool resources are. But what that means is if you're irrigating and you decide to reduce your irrigation to save the aquifer or your water, and you're the neighbor, you draw his water that he's saving, because it's a common pool resource. which means to really protect the resource, everyone has to be somewhere on the same page, and that's what we're. So it's difficult in that way. It's some areas farmers have already stopped irrigating. And we'll talk a little bit about that area. Most areas in Kansas in the western third, where most of the aquifer, have had well capacity declines. On our experiment station in Garden City, when we first drilled our wells, we were around 1,500 gallons per minute. Now we're around 300 gallons per minute. So we've seen big, so we're in a transition period. Many areas have been at full irrigation. Some are at limited irrigation now. We're maybe 20 years ago, we had most of them have a 24-inch allocation per year in Kansas. So they have the ability to put on 24 inches. Most of them are probably in that 8 to 15-inch range just because they don't have the well capacity. There's not enough days in the year to pump enough to get their full allocation. One thing to put in there, think about under all the states in there, it's regulated by the state, has regulatory, and it's different between states, but without a doubt, additional regulations at the state level to reduce water withdrawals are going to be difficult. Just politically, we're anti-regulatory there, and it's difficult to do that. We'll talk about what we're looking at in Kansas to do. Our rural economies are dependent upon the aquifer. Our feedlot industry, which is dependent upon the feed produced by the corn in the aquifer, the packing plant, jobs, bioenergy. All of the areas that have water tend to be more economically viable than those that don't have water out there. We've done a tremendous job, both research and implementation for irrigation efficiency. And I heard earlier some talks about irrigation efficiency, and over the last 30 years, we've increased irrigation efficiency an average of 3% per year. So every year, we're growing about 3% more crop production out of the same amount of water. So irrigation efficiency, unfortunately, irrigation efficiency has not decreased groundwater withdrawals. In fact, I would say in some ways it's probably increased consumptive use. And again, we could talk about that, but people find places for water. If you save it, they find another place for the water. The last one there, I just put beneficial use. In Kansas, our law is beneficial use. The state owns the water, but as long as you use it for beneficial use, you have a permit and an allocation. In Texas, they have the right to capture. So in Texas, I think I'm right, as long as you can drill it, it's your water. And you can pump as much as you can pump in most of the Ogallala regions. Now, as we move into I know this is a little difficult to see. On the left there would be the saturated thickness of 2000. On the right would be the water level change in a 20-year period. That's from 1980 to 1999 for the entire aquifer. And you can see, if you look at it's really difficult to see. You see southwest Nebraska, for example, they really haven't had a lot of change in aquifer depletion or the reduction in saturated thickness. In Kansas, southwest Kansas, you can see there on this particular map in the Texas, declines of more than 50 feet. We've had declines of greater than 100 feet of saturated thickness. So if you think about drilling a new well, you would have to go down another 100 feet to get to water or more. We go to the next map, this would be if I can get it to work, this is a time sequence, and we'll go through it a couple times, of just Kansas, of western Kansas, and this would be the change in feet of saturated thickness from 1996 to 2012. So you go through that again, and you can see the decline in aquifer depletion over that 16-year period there. Again, declines of over 70 feet in many areas. The thing that this doesn't do, if I go back to the previous slide, If I go back to the previous slide, the thing that we do see, and we see southwest Kansas there, we have more saturated thickness. So it hasn't hit them as bad as it does. As we get into what I call east central Kansas, there's a lobe there we call groundwater management number 1. And that area had less water to start with. And even though their depletion doesn't look as great, As we'll look in a little bit later, we may be at 50% depletion already in that area. So everybody's at limited irrigation in that one. If we look at it a different way, this would be the Ogallala, this would be the aquifer in Kansas, the amount of depletion we had over a 15-year period, 1996 to 2011. On the average, this would be the feet below ground before you get to the water table there. So it's depleted in that 15 years on the average about, what is that, about 10 feet. We've been in drought in 2012, 2013, and we've had, depending on where we are, we've had from 5 to 15 feet of additional depletion because of the drought in those 2 years. So you can see why it's a problem. And if we look at it a different way, give you a little more background on it, this would, again, would be Kansas. And a number of years ago, we had estimated, well, back in the 1990s, that to do irrigation, full irrigation, we needed the minimum of a 400 gallon per minute well capacity that we could pump for 90 days. Because at that time, the management was you turn your irrigation well on the 1st of June, and you turned it off on the 1st of September. Pretty easy management. You never shut it off. And so that's where you get the 90 days. And so to do full irrigation, we had to be in that 400 gallons per minute. And so by taking if we looked at use between 2001 through 2003 to 2011, and then predicted to the future if we use that same water use, how long could we do a full irrigation? How long would it last? And so you can see here, if you're in the brown, I know it's a little hard, brown would say that we're already below the minimum threshold for full irrigation. So if you're in the area of the brown, we would call that either limited irrigation or in some areas where they've stopped irrigating. So if you go out in that east central, you're out in this area, groundwater management number 1, you can see almost the entire area there is now in limited irrigation. And we're talking about years now before it's at a depletion. So we've got a lot of irrigators in this area now that are putting multiple wells together to irrigate, to get enough well capacity to irrigate. Some of the others at that current rate, we're looking at under 25 years at full irrigation, others 25 to 50. And then we've got some areas that, again, have greater groundwater depletion. So you can see why it's a significant issue in Kansas, and it's a real issue. If we look at recharge is minimal in most of the area, and we calculated it was calculated in 2007, which was a fairly wet year that year, one of our wetter years. That year we used about 2.4 million acre feet out of the Ogallala. Last year, I think we were around 3.2 million acre feet. We had a recharge in the region of 0.72 million feet. So you can see the disconnect there between recharge versus most years. Our recharge is about 10% of annual usage would be the recharge amount. So to become sustainable, we would have to reduce our irrigation by about 90%. And that's not going to happen. That would make it non-viable. Now, one of the things is we start planning for the future, and that is what's the water worth? And there's been a lot of questions. Is the water worth more this year, or will it be worth more to the state in 50 years? So that when you start planning, it's, and anybody that's an economist, and I'm not, and you do a production function, what's worth the most? The first few inches is worth the most. And then we'd say the last few inches should be worth the least. Is that right? As an economist. So if we look at the value of water, you can see what's happened to crop prices the last few years. They've exploded, right? So the value of water has went up a lot. For example, it increased, you can see for real value of water increased about 0.4% for the 25 years prior to 1999. For the 10-year period of 2000 to 2011, the actual value of water went up about 10%. And last year in western Kansas for irrigated corn, an acre foot of water at the farm level to the irrigator was worth about $550 for 12 inches of water. So that's what it's worth. And then as we factor that through the economy, then you can come up with some bigger figures. So it is a real economic issue. And the question is, what will this water, if it's worth, an acre foot worth $750, for example, that year, what will it be worth in 2025 or 2050 to the state? Will it be worth more in the future than what it is now to future generations? So that's one of the factors that comes in as we start planning for the Ogallala. So the options for Kansas, and we're doing a vision, 50-year vision for Kansas right now. The governor's declared, and so we're doing it, and they've had about 135 local stakeholder meetings, mostly with irrigators so far across the state. And here's the things that we've heard as we're out there, and we've heard all of them. And one of them is keep pumping until it's gone. It's a natural resource. It's like oil. Keep pumping it. When it's gone, it's gone. We won't irrigate anymore. That's one of the options. I think that in some areas we've already done that. We've already pumped until usable water's gone. At one time we thought economics, once we got below a certain amount, we'd never run out of water. I think now that with the technology that we have, I think we're going to pump forever, basically until it's gone. One of the other ones is to reduce withdrawal rates. And I'll show you some data on if we reduce 20%, how long will that make the aquifer last? Or 50% or 80%. We've done some economic studies to see the impact on the economy. What's our response? And really there we're saying, what's our responsibilities to the next generation and the next generation as we move forward? One of the others we hear a lot of, and we're going to do this, and that is we need research to increase irrigation efficiency. We need more drought-resistant crops. As we reduce water availability, increase irrigation efficiency, still make it economic. And then there's another one we get, and that is to go to sustainable yield. And that's not going to happen. Sustainable yield means we reduce irrigation by 90%. And that would make irrigation so it's not viable. Some of the things we've done, just real quickly, I'm about out of time here. We've had a number of legislative changes. We're working on developing what we call local enhanced management areas. That would be local citizens in an area going together and developing their own management plans. And we've got one of those that's through a ballot and a vote. We've got one of those where they've reduced, last year that got started, they voluntarily agreed to reduce their water use by 20% across the region. And the first year they reduced it 25%. So we've got some of those. One of the things that's interesting, we are doing a study now from an old study looking, and it is looking at the opportunity to transfer water from the Missouri River across Kansas to western Kansas, transfer as much as 3 million acre-feet per year through an aqueduct system. So we're looking at that, looking at the viability of that. We could talk about that for a long time also. Some predictions. One of the things, just real quickly here, corn has been viable. If we look at crop production, irrigated production, you can see what's happened. Corn is king now. Corn is where we make money. Any of you in the Corn Belt know there's been a lot of investment in corn. And feedlots like to use corn. Bioenergy likes to use corn. We grow corn. And some of the other crops that used to be in here that were more drought resistant, less water, needed less water, have become less popular. If we look at the estimated what's going to happen there, and there's a good study by one of my colleagues at K-State, David Stewart, looking at what's happened in the past and look at predicting for the future at the current rate. He's done some economic studies. Right now, you can see the storage in the Kansas part of the aquifer, in northwest Kansas, west central, southwest Kansas, pre-development, and there we're really talking about pre-1950. By the amount we had in storage still in the aquifer in 1960, what we have today, west central Kansas, for example, we have used 61% of the available water that was stored. We would predict in 50 years, they would be at 18% of the storage, or we could say across the entire aquifer, 69% of the water would be used by 2060. And by 2110, we'd be down to about 13% of the water. So you can see that. If we look at it just in another way, and really the only way to increase the longevity of the aquifer is to pump less. is the only way to do it. And so if we look at, again, this would be different reductions in percent still in storage in the aquifer compared to pre-development. If we reduce it or we don't reduce it, you can see the amount left in each region in 2010. 20% reduction if we started today and reduced irrigation by 20%, by 40%, by 60%, even by 80%, we still don't get to a sustainable yield there. We could have state of Texas come up, and I think their data is probably worse than our data even in some ways. They're probably in a little worse shape than what we're in. The thing that I think is a little bit of a concern as you look at it, we have not factored in climate change yet. And our climate change predictions all the way from 1 to 4 degrees increase Fahrenheit over the next 50 years. What happens when we increase temperatures? We increase ET, even not in, and so when we factor that in, I think it's even maybe a more dire situation. So I thought I'd throw this one up there. We're going to get to one of these, and we're going to, regardless of what happens. It's going to be we're either going to, some places we're going to pump until it's gone, and we were already there. Others we're going to reduce I think, the withdrawal rates, but we're never going to get to a sustainable yield and still irrigate. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
You're walking back. I just had a quick question for you. My prerogative as moderator. I was thinking about land prices and land values, and if they're correlated with that one map that you showed where the water table was rapidly depleted. Anybody doing any look at land values with the idea that the water supply is a capitalized asset that would be part of the land value?
Yeah, they ask about the land value, and the land value, obviously, under irrigated land is worth a lot more. And part of it depends, there's a lot of factors going land value. One is what's your water right? And again, water rights are really complicated because we have vested rights. Vested rights were before the Water Appropriation Act, and they're pretty much wide open to do whatever. If you had a well before 1945, you can do anything you want. It doesn't come under any kind of legal restrictions. But the lower your water right, or the stronger your water right, the greater the land value is. Because again, the later the right, the greater the chances you're going to be shut off.
Well, that wasn't quite my question. You could have paper water rights all you want, but if you don't have water underneath your ground, you're not. Your ground isn't going to be worth as much. That was my point, and I was just wondering if people are smart enough in Kansas to see, hey, that guy doesn't have any more water left, and I'm not going to pay for his land.
Yeah, that's a good point. In Kansas, we do have every well is metered, and we have about 30 years of records for each meter in the state that's publicly available. And the more water you have, the greater the land value. And the less, and you can tell it because I can get online today and I can tell what you pumped last year, because it's all public information.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. Another hand for Dan.